Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security.
Everything seems impossible until it happens.
Everyone would be affected by a nuclear war.
Our government is planning to spend trillions of dollars to develop new nuclear weapons that we don't need.
You can't win a nuclear war.
We are all experts on nuclear weapons because we are all going to be affected by those nuclear weapons.
And here's your host, Joe Cirincione.
Welcome back to Press the Button. I'm Joe Cirincione, your host. This is our 26th episode, and I'm doing it solo this week. Our co-host, Michelle Dover, is still traveling, so you are stuck with me. We start off as usual with our 7-minute synopsis of nuclear national security news. We keep it to 7 minutes because that, unbelievably, is how much time the president would have should he be informed of a nuclear attack in the United States. That is the maximum amount of time the president has to decide on whether to launch, whether the threat was real or not. Scary stuff. I then answer a question from Mike from Virginia about nukes in outer space. This is a regular feature now, and I love it. Surprise questions that I don't see beforehand that are sent in by our listeners. If you would like to ask me a question, please send it to press the button, one word, press the button at ploughshares.org. And then we get to the real meat of the episode, a terrific interview with Dr. Emma Belcher of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. They're the largest grant maker in the nuclear policy space, and Emma is in charge of all the grants they give out. We discuss the role of philanthropy in nuclear policy, and we particularly talk about the two existential threats to humanity: climate change and nuclear weapons. We examine how these similar topics are being dealt with in very different ways. Remember, if you like what you hear, rate us, share us, subscribe to Press the Button. This is incredibly invaluable to us in spreading the word and letting us know what you think about the podcast. We appreciate all your comments so far, and we appreciate how much this podcast is growing. Every single week, more subscribers are added. But enough of that. The clock is ticking. Let's go.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Welcome to the 26th edition of Early Warning. Joe and Michelle, who are your usual hosts, are out of town this week, so I'm it. I am Tom Collina. I'm the Director of Policy here at Ploughshares Fund. And it is a pleasure to have with me this morning two excellent guests, Erica Fein, who's the Advocacy Director with Win Without War. Erica, great to have you here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
And Akshai Vikram, who is our new Hale Fellow here at Ploughshares. Akshay, great to have you.
Of course. Hello.
So we will be continuing our conversation on how impeachment, because of course we can't talk about anything else in Washington right now, how impeachment is affecting nuclear policy and national security. We started this conversation last week. We see no reason to change that conversation, so we're going to do more of it this week. And you know, the way we see it, there's at least three dangers, I'm sure there's more, about how impeachment can affect national security, and particularly the Trump administration at this delicate time. One is the president may seek to distract, right? How do we change the conversation away from impeachment? That could be war with Iran. It could be any kind of crisis you could imagine, but that one comes to mind. It could be distracting with diplomacy, with a deal. Right? Could we have a deal with Iran or North Korea? And that might distract away from impeachment. Or taking a play out of the Nixon playbook, the president could talk about using nuclear weapons, as President Nixon talked about when he was heading towards impeachment in 1974. I could go back into my office and in 25 minutes, 70 million people will be dead. The kind of thing that Nixon would like to talk about. So those are three types of dangers that one could see with the impeachment debate. But let's focus on two aspects of impeachment in particular. One is the impact on the National Defense Authorization Act conference that's happening on Capitol Hill right now. And then we can talk about how impeachment is affecting international diplomacy and a little bit about the presidential campaign. But let's start, Erica, with you. What are your thoughts about how impeachment is affecting the ongoing National Defense Authorization Act conference process?
Sure. I think that impeachment is going to impact every facet of congressional life up until the end of this year and then through next year. But for the purposes of the NDA, we need to talk about the next 3 months. The House and Senate are negotiating the final version. Those negotiations have been underway for some time. The Armed Services Committee are not the primary players in the impeachment process. And so their work is going to continue. But as we understand it, they are at a standstill. And some of the key aspects of their disagreements surround Trump's border wall and providing any type of funding for it, whether future funding or backfilling it. And so that remains at an impasse. And then some of the other policy provisions remain also impacted. So we're talking about the deployment of Trump's new low-yield nuclear weapon for our strategic submarines. The House version of the NDAA has a ban on deployment. The Senate version does not. We're also talking about the Iran provision. So the House has a provision to ban funding for any unauthorized attack on Iran by this administration. The Senate version does not have that in it. So these things are still very much in play.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Now, in my view anyway, certainly we've been arguing against Trump's low-yield nuclear weapon for quite some time on security grounds. But particularly now, it seems hard for the Democrats to argue that on the one hand, we should impeach Trump for national security reasons, and on the other hand, hand him a brand new nuclear weapon, as might happen if the Senate doesn't hold up the House prohibition. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that would certainly look bad. And the House, one of the things that happened when the House was considering its bill earlier this summer was they had a bunch of policies that were added as amendments, including the nuclear weapons prohibition and the Iran prohibition. And they did that because the bill was authorizing $733 billion in unrestrained Pentagon spending to this reckless president. And so you needed some constraints on the president. We need to see Democrats really have a spine here. It's not going to look good to their constituents and to voters next year.
Thank you. Do you think it could actually imperil the top line budget if there aren't these constraints on specific programs?
Unfortunately, I think the top line budget is set, and that's why these policy provisions are so important.
Got it. Okay, Akshay, turning to you. Give us a sense of how you're seeing impeachment affecting international diplomacy and the presidential campaign.
So impeachment seems to be changing hour by hour, day by day. But I think one abiding emblem of this whole saga will forever be the Finnish president's press conference last week.
Yes, tell us about that.
So there was a lot in that press conference, but I think the most salient moment was when a Finnish reporter asked the Finnish president, what favors has Donald Trump asked of you, to mostly audible gasps from the other reporters in the room. I think it's going to be a big problem going forward. I mean, Joe alluded to this last week, but I think it's going to basically be a twofold dilemma for foreign leaders. One is, who's going to negotiate with the United States? Negotiating with the United States opens you up to all sorts of allegations that you might be coerced by this president or other people in his cabinet into digging up political dirt on his opponents. And that's going to put a damper on any foreign government's willingness to kind of reach out to the United States to talk about important issues. The second part is, who on our end are these foreign governments supposed to negotiate with? This was already an understaffed administration with very important positions empty well into its first term. And now we have senior members of the administration starting to turn against each other and turn against the president and start arguing about who told which government to do what favors for the boss. So I think that it's going to be a problem as North Korea and Iran continue to be in the news for the United States to reach an agreement with any of its adversaries or allies on these important issues.
Thank you. And the missiles are coming, but very quickly, give us your sense of how impeachment affects the horse race on the campaign trail.
So I think that the biggest beneficiary, somewhat luckily for her, is Senator Elizabeth Warren. She had come out with a big anti-corruption platform right before this impeachment whistleblower complaint came through, and she seems poised to benefit quite a bit from this impeachment hearing. It depends how much this affects Joe Biden. Right now, it doesn't seem like he did anything wrong, but that's no prerequisite for getting in trouble politically. If he goes tarnished by this scandal, I think that leaves room for Senator Kamala Harris to kind of swoop in and pick up some of his voters. But that will all have to happen at the debate next week when she has her last chance to make her case.
And that debate is October 15th.
Yes.
Right. And there is the siren. We are out of time. I want to thank you both very much. Erica and Akshay, thanks for being here. To be continued.
We get letters. We get stacks and stacks of letters.
Another week, another question. Mike from Virginia asks, I just saw Ad Astra with Brad Pitt as an astronaut. Without giving anything away, nukes in outer space are touched on in the movie. But how effective would a nuclear weapon be in outer space? Would it be as powerful as it is on the ground?
Good question. Thank you, Mike, for asking this. Okay, let me think through this. Number one, no. The easy answer is so much of the damage from a nuclear weapon depends on blast, which depends on air. There is no air in outer space, so no one can hear you scream, and no one can feel the blast of a nuclear weapon. Radiation, however, would actually be a little enhanced. Radiation would not be dispersed by the atmosphere, so radiation would be at least as effective in outer space. In fact, just a little known fact, Ronald Reagan launched the Star Wars program because he believed that Ed Teller told him he had a secret weapon at Lawrence Livermore, the X-ray laser that could wipe out the entire first wave of a Soviet strike. The X-ray laser depended on a nuclear bomb going off in space, capturing the radiation through little fiber optic rods and sort of turning it into laser energy that would zap each of these warheads. So completely fantasy weapon, never existed, doesn't exist, completely implausible. But it illustrates that radiation, when concentrated in a nuclear weapon, can last over many, many kilometers. And finally, heat. Well, that's a form of radiation. You would get heat from that, so there'd be a thermal effect, mostly close in, but because space is a big place, the distance would lead to the rapid dispersion of any of that heat energy. So radiation would mainly be the big thing. I'm afraid if you used it on the Death Star, yes, absolutely. If you used it on the landing craft from the aliens in Independence, absolutely. If there's material right around with some atmosphere, it could impact. But by itself, in outer space, I haven't seen the movie, so I don't know what the nuclear weapon does, but it would be a smaller impact than it would on an atmosphere or if it was near material objects.
Well, there you go, Brad Pitt. If you're considering nuclear weapons, I'm not sure that's the way to go.
And I'm available for consultations in Hollywood anytime.
And now, a special message from Stephen Miles, Executive Director of Win Without War, a Ploughshares Fund grantee.
Hi, this is Stephen Miles from Win Without War. We're a network of activists and organizations working for a more peaceful, progressive U.S. foreign policy. With support from Ploughshares Fund, we're mobilizing public support for diplomacy with North Korea and Iran, as well as working to stop a new global nuclear arms race. But today I'd like to talk to you about getting involved in helping to stop a war with Iran. As you may have heard, Donald Trump has gotten himself into a little bit of trouble lately. As Congress moves towards impeachment, a lot of folks have asked me if there's an increased danger of going to war with Iran. And the short answer is, horrifyingly, yes. You see, up until now, Trump has seemingly resisted his war cabinet's calls to press the button, as it were. But as he gets more desperate, as he needs a distraction, well, all that might change. And that's where we come in. You see, only Congress has the power to authorize war. And when it comes to Iran, they've been crystal clear. They haven't given their authorization. Right now, Congress is debating whether to pass legislation to block Donald Trump from starting a war with Iran. And you can be sure that Congress is hearing from pro-war special interests. So let's make sure they hear from pro-diplomacy champions too. We've made it super easy to take action. Just go to winwithoutwar.org and click on Take Action. There you'll find all sorts of ways to make your voice heard, especially stopping a dangerous war with Iran before it ever starts. Thank you.
I'm Joe Cirincione in the Glass and Closed Nerve Center of Ploughshares Fund in Washington, D.C. with Dr. Emma Belcher. Emma, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Joe. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks for inviting me along.
Emma is the director of the MacArthur Foundation's Nuclear Challenges Program, and we're going to talk about philanthropy today. We're going to talk about money. Most of this podcast has been about policies and about politics, but what's the role of foundations in this mix? What do we try to do? We're both foundations. Ploughshares Fund is a small foundation, and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, as every listener of NPR knows, supports creative people and effective institutions committed to building a more just, verdant, and peaceful world. But what does that mean? And that's you give out, Emma, as a foundation, about $300 million worth of grants each year. That's a lot of money. And how much of that, you're one of the few foundations that give out funds for international security, for global security. How much of your portfolio is devoted to that?
Yes, I'd say, Joe, that really right now we're focused on nuclear security as it falls within the whole global security kind of architecture. So when we look at our funding on nuclear issues, nuclear policy, it's around $20 million per year, which I believe is around a half of all nuclear funding in the United States.
Right. This might surprise some of our listeners. There are three foundations that dominate the nuclear philanthropy space, and that's you, MacArthur, and then there's the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and then surprisingly, this Ploughshares Fund. We're the little brother of you two, but together we account for most of the nuclear funding that goes on. So let me just get the big picture from you. When you look out on the policies today, when you look at the nuclear security field, do you see challenges? Do you see opportunities? How do you look at this? What's your big picture on this?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I think I see both. Challenges, I think, have been pretty profound in the last couple of years. And I think we're looking at nuclear issues have really raised their head since the end of the Cold War, when I think a lot of people felt that they'd gone away with the fall of the Soviet Union. I think right now, we're really at a pretty critical point in all things nuclear. We see a sort of degradation of the rules and the norms that have been really a linchpin in the last several decades of nuclear policy. When we look at arms control, we see some of the agreements falling apart and threatening to fall apart, potential non-extension of New START coming up. And this is really particularly concerning as well when we see that a number of countries, the United States included, looking to drastically modernise their arsenals and spend trillions of dollars in the process. And it really seems as though we've made a lot of progress at the end of the Cold War, drastically reduced the number of weapons from between 60 to 70,000, now down to around 14,000, yet there are indications now that we're going in the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. We're sort of going back to a world where we see much more risk potentially on the nuclear front. So I think that's really concerning. And I think the consensus around how do we deal with these nuclear weapons is starting to fall apart in dangerous ways. I think we also see that not just sort of concern amongst US allies about the strength of alliance relationships and their own security, potentially thinking about whether or not they need to invest in their own nuclear arsenals. But also this sort of tension between the countries that have weapons and those that don't, and a real sense that we're at an inflection point where the kind of commitments countries have made in the past to disarm are being severely tested and challenged. And there's a sense of, injustice and unfairness in this sort of the rules and the regime as it currently exists, which has injected a sort of a hostility into nuclear diplomacy. So I think we're seeing real problems and potential challenges, and if we're not careful, we could really end up going in a pretty drastic direction that no one wants to see. In that, however, I see great opportunity, because I think what's happened is people have become a bit more energized. Nuclear topics are definitely more in the news.
Yes.
We have more Americans more aware of the dangers and the very key dangers that they possess potentially to their everyday lives in a way no one has had to, thankfully, think about for a number of decades. And I think when that comes into sharper focus, we start to see people question, is this the world we really want to live in?
Mm-hmm.
Are we prepared to settle with this status quo? Or should we not be doing bigger thinking and thinking about where do we want to be and work backwards from there, rather than just moving forward, reacting to each crisis as they happen? So I do see energy and enthusiasm. I see it as a moment to take this greater public awareness and try and really kind of push the point about we are in charge of our own futures. We need to really get to work on that.
That's great. What a way to begin. In this town, in Washington, D.C., there's differences over nuclear doctrine, but there's a general acceptance of the theory of deterrence, that we need to have large nuclear forces in order to protect the United States. Or as former Secretary of Defense Ash Carter said, nuclear weapons are the bedrock of our national security. What you really want to argue about is on the edges, this weapon or that weapon, the budget overall. Is that the way you're approaching it, or do you think there's something more fundamental about our nuclear doctrine?
I think there's something much more fundamental about the nuclear doctrine. I think when we look at where it came from, it was developed the end of the 1940s, early 1950s, by a small group of people, really, in a very small amount of time.
Small group of men.
You said it, Joe. There were academics from, very smart people, academics from...
In fact, I can't think of a single woman involved in the 50s or 60s nuclear debates.
Right.
I'm interrupting.
I believe that... How appropriate. I believe there probably were a couple of women at various points along the way involved in different projects, but you're right. None springs to mind right now. Of that initial group of Harvard, MIT, and Rand scholars.
Yes.
And I believe they basically, there was a time at which the Soviets had developed thermonuclear weapons, and there was a real sense that the US was no longer in this position of authority and power over nuclear weapons. You had an adversary that had developed thermonuclear weapons. And so we need to think very quickly about how do you prevent disaster from happening. And so, they based on game theoretic models, came up with deterrence theory. Mm-hmm. So basically, I nuke you, you nuke me, and we all lose. So then we're sort of deterred from sort of launching a first strike in the first place.
No one can win this game, so let's not play.
Right, absolutely. But the problem with that is it really doesn't allow for basic human behavior and mistakes, miscalculation, misunderstanding, accidents, and we really are gambling a lot of our future generations on a theory that threatens to annihilate nameless people on the other side of the earth for our own security, that is not robust enough to allow for accidents and miscalculations, and where I think we're starting to see there's a lack of empirical evidence to show that this actually works as well in practice as it does in theory. Mm-hmm. And I think we really need to, it's incumbent upon us now, not to just accept this doctrine as status quo as it's been passed down generation to generation. We need to involve people with different perspectives, people who don't benefit from sustaining the status quo, to come and challenge our way of thinking, because it's hugely important. It's an existential issue that could drastically change our lives very quickly, and we're not thinking enough, and we're not challenging these ideas in a way that I think we need to inform ourselves and develop better policy.
Right. We've recently seen the global strike for the climate crisis, one of the most dramatic developments I've seen. In fact, I can't remember a global strike about anything, and this one inspired by youth. And to me, they're bringing a new sense of urgency to the other existential threat. I think we agree on this.
We do.
There are of all the challenges we face, there are only two that threaten planetary destruction. One is the climate crisis, which can destroy human civilization over decades, and the other is nuclear weapons, which can do it in an afternoon. So we're seeing this sense of urgency develop around the climate crisis now more and more. Are you seeing this on the nuclear crisis, on the nuclear side of the agenda?
I wish I were. I'm seeing definitely greater awareness. I think the concerning situations with North Korea and, the situation we were in 2017 where there was potentially talk of a strike, not necessarily nuclear, military strike against North Korea and the potential for escalation in that region. And, the possibility that North Korea was close to developing sort of intercontinental ballistic missiles that could threaten continental United States. I think that brought that into sharp focus. It made people concerned. But I also worry that we managed to get our way through that crisis and it's sort of fallen off people's radar again.
Yes.
It's not at that sustained level that something like climate is. It is interesting, I find, when I go around as part of my job and talk to people, particularly younger people, my experience is when they know a little bit more,
yes,
they're actually horrified.
Yes.
And they're both horrified at the fact of, how many weapons there are, the potential for something to go wrong very quickly, but they're also horrified that they didn't know about it.
Yes.
And, I think clearly climate is hugely important. It's the other existential threat, as you know. When we look at philanthropic dollars, though, there's almost $1 billion in private philanthropic dollars in the United States per year devoted to climate, and there's 40 million devoted to nuclear. So this is where I think we need not just new ideas, but we need new people to come to the table with funding to actually enable this community that we have, that really is an excellent group of people, to help it elevate what it already knows and communicate it more broadly to get that sense of urgency and action that we so desperately need on
Yes,
nuclear.
it'd be wonderful to have the Ford Foundation back in the game, for example, the
Absolutely.
Hewlett Foundation, some of the Gates Foundation. We're not asking them a lot, just
that's right.
a little from each would help. But how would we convince them to do that? Looking at the portfolio you have, what's your strategy? How do you decide what you want to spend money on?
So I think our focus really right now is to sort of protect the health of the regime that we have and think about how we can prevent the current deterioration from deteriorating faster.
Yes, that tipping point, a collapse point.
Absolutely. And figure out how we can get to a stabilization point so that once we're more stabilized, we can look at transformational change again. So what we're trying to focus on now is looking at our funds that we have and the people in the field doing excellent work. What are the key priority areas to make sure that the regime doesn't completely fall apart? And where can our foundation funding help in that? There are certain topics on which foundation funding isn't going to help particularly. So that's maybe not the best way for us to make our investment. So we've developed a strategy and we've looked at a couple of key areas that we see as really important right now. One of those is US-Russia relations. The two countries that have over 90% of the world's weapons and weapons-usable material, their relationship has sort of then a ripple effect on the rest of the countries in the regime. And where we are now is very dangerous, with an inability to communicate and an inability to work together in a way that the United States and the Soviet Union were sort of able to communicate toward the end of the Cold War. I think that has sort of greatly diminished, and so we're in a much more dangerous situation right now. We also need to do more in sort of educating people, particularly members in Congress who have definitely shown an interest in these topics. But I think the general lack of awareness and education on the Hill is particularly troubling. We didn't, in previous eras, we did have Nunn and Lugar who were very much champions of working together across the divide because nuclear issues were so important. We seem to lose that, and we seem to lose this sort of sense of wanting to work together for the greater good. So that's another priority for us. And we have a few more. We're looking at the tension between countries that have weapons and those that don't, and how this sort of sense of lack of progress, potentially unfairness, and the sense that the countries are talking past each other. We're trying to find ways in which can they find common ground. That's another area. And then we're also looking at relationships, US alliance relationships, as I mentioned earlier, and the countries that might be questioning the strength of that relationship and starting to think about whether they shouldn't create their own capabilities.
So how do you affect this change? Who are what kinds of grants do you give? When I go up to your website, by the way, what's your website address?
Oh, it's www.macfound.org.
And your particular program, how do they
it's
find
called
it?
the Nuclear Challenges
Nuclear
program.
Challenges.
Yeah.
So I look and I see that you are funding the Arms Control Association, the Atlantic Council, the Brookings Institution, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the Federation of American Scientists, Global Zero. I can go on and on. I just got to the G's there. There's 14 pages of this.
Right.
You fund just about everybody.
Yes.
So how do you decide? So you I hear your big picture. How do you decide who's going to make a difference and who's not?
Yeah, I think what we look at first is, who has the credibility and the credentials to actually work on the specific topic in which we're interested and that we've signalled as a priority. But we're not only looking for the smartest people, we're looking for people who can distill their in-depth research on these complex topics into recommendations, and they can clearly communicate those recommendations to people in government and others to inform them about the best decisions that they should be taking. And really, I think the approach here is you want to be able to support people who will have the time and the space to do in-depth thinking and research in a way that government officials might not be able to or have the luxury, and then be able to communicate what they have. But we really see NGOs, experts outside of government, working in two ways. One way is to provide these policy recommendations, as I've mentioned. Another is to hold governments accountable. So it's a sort of a dual kind of focus. So one is you want to help in the way that you might be able to, but you also want to be able to shine a light where you think that government policy isn't where it should be, and where there are problematic developments that need to be corrected. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, and of course all of our funding is bipartisan, is non-partisan, so we're sort of looking to support a wide range of people with ideas and I think really a demonstrated history of having impact.
It's been my pleasure to work with you over the last few years and to see the collaboration grow between the funders, the donors that are involved in this. And MacArthur's been very influential, key even, to bringing all these groups together. How is this? Have you seen this too? How do you feel about the donor collaboration?
I feel really terrific about it. I think it's something that when I first came to the foundation 8 years ago now, I think a few of us sort of noted that we wanted to be able to collaborate more, and we saw that we have a common interest. And so I think we've really worked together in a way that's been terrific, and it really helps that everybody's a nice, smart, engaging person to deal with. So I think, that kind of side of things has really worked very well.
Yeah, there is a nice camaraderie among the
There really is. And it's been interesting.
We like
and I
each
think
other.
we do. And we might not always have exactly the same strategy. We might not agree on exactly.
Well, that's part of the strength,
but
right?
That's what it is. And I think certainly when you have conversations with others who don't necessarily think alike or come from a different background or point of view, that's when you are able to sharpen your own analysis and thinking. That's what we're seeking from our grantee community as well. I think what we're looking for and what our program is particularly interested in now is bringing in those who have traditionally been excluded from discussions about nuclear weapons and national security, who can bring different perspectives and viewpoints, and really, I think that's diversity in a range of perspectives, right? So it's both diversity in the sense of, the sort of ethnic, racial, gender diversity, but it's also diversity in terms of the fields of expertise and the knowledge, and bringing people kind of together. What we've been doing through N Square, for example, the Funder Collaborative, bringing people, ex-nuclear experts together with people from other fields who have different expertise, who can help them with how to better message their recommendations to policymakers.
As our board member and your predecessor at MacArthur, Kenneth Benedict, says at the beginning of this podcast, we're all experts on nuclear weapons because we're all impacted by nuclear weapons.
That's absolutely correct.
So we have to broaden the voices that are discussing and making nuclear policy. How did your voice start? How did you get involved in this field? Why are you here?
Yeah, that's a great question. Believe it or not, I can trace this back to when I was 14 years old. I remember the classroom I was sitting in.
Really?
The seat I was sitting in.
High school? Or
It was high school in Australia. So probably about 8th grade, I suppose.
Okay.
And I remember actually an anti-nuclear activist, Dr. Helen Caldecott, physician, she had actually been an alum at my high school years earlier, and she was coming to give a talk in our assembly about nuclear weapons. So our social studies teacher thought she'd better teach us about nuclear weapons so we could understand what was going on. And I remember learning about, the explosive power of weapons and deterrence theory, and both being mortified but fascinated at the same time. And it was a kind of a tension, I think, that was uncomfortable, and that I've probably carried with me throughout my career. Now, I'm not saying from age of 14 I dedicated my life to this. That's not true.
It's a straight line.
It absolutely wasn't. But I became interested in international law, the ethics of the use of force, and, as I went throughout my career, I sort of honed in much more narrowly on nuclear weapons policy and international law and cooperation.
You were a former Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Council on CFR?
Council on Foreign Relations.
Council on Foreign Relations, and advisor to the Prime Minister in Cabinet at Australia?
It was, yes, the Prime Minister and Cabinet's department. I was an advisor on national security
I have no idea what that means, but it sounds very impressive. And where'd you go to school? Where'd you get your degrees?
Yeah, so I went to the University of Melbourne, and I did an exchange year at Georgetown University, and that set my life on this trajectory that was fabulous. So then I ended up getting a Master's of Arts in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts.
Oh, great school.
Yeah, wonderful school. And then went on and got my PhD there as well.
Wonderful.
So that was, led me here.
Before I let you go, we're near the end of the interview here. I was wondering what your view is of the future of this field. I mean, how you're in a position to help shape it. You're doing the best you can to make sure that every dime of John D. and Catherine T.'s endowment is invested correctly. What do you think? How are you feeling?
Yeah, I'm feeling as though right now we have people who are reacting and responding to all of the challenges that are being thrown at them on a daily basis. We need to do that. And we also need to be thinking about where are we going over the next few decades? Because if we've got our heads down reacting to the latest crisis, we're not thinking creatively and inventively about stopping this cycle. Yes. We're not taking more control over where we want to go. So what I'm seeing now is an opportunity for this. There are people who are willing to challenge conventional wisdom, challenge the status quo, say this is not good enough. People from different fields are very interested in coming and looking at this problem. And we have younger people whose voices have traditionally been excluded from the nuclear priesthood. Yeah. So this is where I think we need to go, as well as keeping our eye on the day-to-day. And I do think that this is happening. There's a real top-down, bottom-up interest in making this happen, and I think the time is now. And I think if I could just leave you with one thing, it would be to thank everybody for this. We are exceptionally proud of the grantees that we support. We know it's very hard work, and people are stretched, they're tired, they're reacting very quickly to the current, but to see that there's still vision there and interest in putting us on a better trajectory, it's really terrific. So I can only say thanks, and we really appreciate the work.
And I appreciate you, Emma. Thank you very much for this interview. It's been a pleasure working with you over these past years on this. I'm proud to be your colleague. This was a brilliant interview.
Thanks, Joe, and likewise, the pleasure's all mine.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil and Zach Brown. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.